Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn, the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and welcome to our program today. We will be talking about Eyck Freymann's new book on One Belt, One Road, Chinese Power Meets the World. And moderating our discussion will be our Director of FPRI's Asia program, Jacques deLisle, whom many of you know well. He's the Stephen A. Cousin Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center of the Study for Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. He's got a new book coming out, Taiwan Under Tsai, which is co-edited with another FPRI senior fellow, June Teufel-Dreyer. As I mentioned, that's coming out later this year, I think pretty eminently. His most recent book, To Get Rich is Glorious, Challenges Facing China's Economic Reform and Opening at 40, was co-edited with Avery Goldstein. Before we get started, I want to remind you to put your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box. And if you start right away adding those questions, Jacques is going to weave them into the conversation. So don't wait until halfway through the program to put in your questions. Go ahead and put them in from the get-go. Before I turn it over to Jacques, I'd also like to say thank you to our FPRI members, sponsors, and board members, many of whom are on the call today. We can't do this without you. It's free to all of you watching, but it's not free to us. So please consider making a generous donation or becoming a member. I also would like to say that the Laude Institute and the Think Tank and Civil Societies program at University of Pennsylvania just came out with its latest findings. And I'm very pleased to say that at least for, I think, 6 or 7 years, we are still #1 in the US for think tanks under 5 million in revenue. So anyway, without further ado, let me go ahead and turn it over to Jacques. Jacques, take it away.
Well, thank you, Raleigh, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. This is a book talk in what is going to be a series of upcoming book talks. Raleigh, I just mentioned the co-edited book on Tsai Ing-wen, Taiwan Under Tsai, that we'll be doing in several weeks' time. We'll be doing another one on yet another co-edited volume with Avery Goldstein called Security Dilemmas in U.S.-China Relations, or sorry, got the title wrong. After Engagement, Dilemmas in U.S.-China Security Relations. You think I'd know that since I have a mock-up of the cover sitting here. Anyway, it gives me great pleasure to welcome today Eyck Freymann. Eyck Freymann is, as Raleigh just told you, the author of One Belt, One Road, Chinese Power Meets the World, and he is that rare doctoral student who already has a book out. So you can get that from Harvard University Press, from Amazon, all the usual sources. We're going to talk about that topic today. So I guess the place to start, obviously, is what exactly is One Belt, One Road, or as it's sometimes called, we'll get into the terminology later, sometimes called the Belt and Road Initiative. Formally, of course, it's an infrastructure project, connectivity across the Eurasian landmass and around the ocean fringe as well. Some see it as a Chinese bid for global influence, perhaps displacing the United States, at least in some parts of the world. And in China, it's a slogan that's getting the kind of attention that really no slogan has gotten since maybe Deng Xiaoping and the beginning of opening and reform. So when you say One Belt, One Road in the title of your book, which version or which versions of that are we talking about?
Well, thank you, Jacques, for that kind introduction. Thank you to Raleigh as well for having me here. It's a privilege to be on this virtual stage with you and to have so many fantastic people in attendance. I see a number of names that I know. Welcome. I hope I can keep you engaged and tell you something that you haven't heard yet. So I suppose the question is, so much ink has been spilled about One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative, in Chinese Yidai Yilu, since Xi Jinping announced it 7 years ago, almost 8 years, that the question is, why do we need another book? Why do we need yet another person in this conversation? Haven't we heard every possible permutation of what this could be about? The answer is, I think many of the most basic assumptions that have governed how we in the West think about One Belt, One Road have been wrong. And they have emerged for the predictable set of reasons, because we're in a circle of journalists citing one another, because the way that we train specialists means that the people who specialize in the financial elements of some of these deals don't necessarily understand the Chinese language or the geopolitical thinking that is going into constructing the initiative in Beijing. The people who are literate in looking at the propaganda aren't necessarily on the ground in some of these recipient countries discussing and with local people, not only the man on the street or the woman on the street, but with local petty officials, what this initiative means to them, both at its most macro and its most micro. And so what this book is an attempt to do is to bring together a number of different conversations that have been happening separately in development studies, security studies, in Chinese elite politics, but also in Chinese foreign policy, and in some of the more specialist literatures about these individual countries that are grappling with One Belt, One Road, and to pull them together into a coherent diagnosis of what this is as a foreign policy challenge to the United States, to assess what the national interests are that we actually have affected by this, and to think through what our potential strategies could be or strategic options could be in deciding how to confront it. That's the way the book is set up. Half of it is considering where it comes from within China, how it has been administered, how it has been pitched to the Chinese people. And then the second half of the book is a series of case studies, looking in particular at 3 Indian Ocean ports, Hambantota in southern Sri Lanka, Piraeus in Greece, and Bagamoyo in Tanzania, and then 4 country-level case studies, China, Iran, Pakistan, and Malaysia, to think about how they've been dealing with this thing in the context of their respective regions. I give this intro to the book. It's the pitch. I need to put up, I need to show it to you so you can know what, you recognize it when you see it, but also because it's important to note that I chose this ridiculous and provocative cover art for a reason. On the cover of the book, I chose to burn all of my bridges in China by depicting Xi Jinping as an emperor wearing clothes made of infrastructure. And that, I think, is the place to start. Because when Xi Jinping announced this scheme 7 years ago, he was not ultimately announcing an infrastructure plan. He was not launching a new form of project financing. Chinese banks, Chinese state-owned enterprises had been doing the sorts of things that we now associate with One Belt, One Road for almost a decade before he came to power. What he was really doing was proposing a new phrase, a tagline, a slogan, which would come to define his legacy, which would be his ticket, as it were, into the history books. Chinese leaders, by unspoken, unwritten convention, are supposed to have their own taglines. Jiang Zemin had the 3 represents. Hu Jintao had the scientific development concept. But Xi Jinping's is different because it is more ambitious. It is, at least as what it claims to be, is a Xin de Sizhou Zhilu, a new Silk Road, a resurrection of an ancient Chinese-led form of regional or even global order, in which China is linked to and placed above its neighbors through a network of trade, tribute, and economic exchange. And it took many years for this to be formalized and developed. It took a rather scattered and haphazard propaganda effort to communicate. But I believe that what this has ultimately settled as is a euphemism for the ancient tributary system, which is a semi-mythic, disputed by historians, but nevertheless widely recognized historical concept for how the Ming and the Qing dynasties at the height of their power interacted with smaller states on their periphery. And I believe if we look closely at the Belt and Road propaganda that has been used to communicate the concept to Chinese audiences, I'm talking about documentary films, but also festivals, all sorts of audiovisual materials, conferences, events of various kinds, up and down the chain of command from the Chinese Communist Party. I believe that this is the essential intellectual innovation that underlies this project. And you can also see it in the revisions that have been made to history textbooks, where some of the basic facts of the ancient Silk Road have been rewritten from scratch, disregarded when convenient, to bring it into alignment and juxtaposition to what Xi Jinping is trying to do today. In particular, his historical avatar is Hanudi, the great emperor from the Han Dynasty who ruled from 141 to 87 BC and oversaw a flowering of culture, the doubling of the territorial extent of the Chinese empire, and is widely regarded as one of the greatest emperors in history. So I think what Xi Jinping is doing, first and foremost, through this initiative, is saying that I'm going to resurrect or rejuvenate the Chinese nation according to this ancient imperial model, inspired loosely by Hanudi's example. And I'm going to do this through infrastructure, development finance, trade, a scattered and rather disorganized and chaotic set of diplomatic and commercial relations to the rest of the world. So it is both a conceptual innovation and it is a very real, very tangible set of exchanges of money and infrastructure and commerce. So I think we should start there, recognizing that it has a concept and a reality. And in a sense, they have been in search of one another for 7 years. Sometimes they line up and sometimes they don't. And if I can make that claim today and persuade you that we should actually think of the Belt and Road as a bifurcated thing, then I will have done what I set out to achieve.
One of the things that has changed in the several years that this slogan and the policies and behaviors underlying it have been fully in place has been a bit of a shift in terminology, right? We used to talk about One Belt, One Road, a literal translation of deLisle, and you're pointing to the historic references that underlay that, the new Silk Road. But in more recent times, we've seen this shortened or morphed phrase that is the Belt and Road Initiative, which obviously the truncated form of One Belt, One Road, NADS initiative. Does the terminology mean anything? Should we think in terms of one rather than the other? I mean, your book uses the earlier phrase.
So, yes, so I ran into a lot of grief for using the earlier translation from peer reviewers and then later from a reviewer who said, only someone who's hard-headed and stubborn and hasn't been paying attention could use the old phrase. It sounds like something an American would do, and guess what? Freymann is American. Well, there's a reason that the United States government still calls this One Belt, One Road. And there's a reason that the Indian government calls it One Belt, One Road. And in fact, a growing number of analysts, I believe, are returning to the phraseology. And the reason is, it has a name in Chinese, Yitai Ilu. And this is not a random name because it is a 4-character phrase with an internal rhythm and logic. China has many 4-character phrases, they call them chengyu, and they are often historical allusions, literary references. They contain many of the historical references, philosophical ideas that are central to Chinese thought. And educated individuals will often pepper their speech with chengyu. Xi Jinping, who seems to have a chip on her shoulder about his disrupted formal education as a young man, uses these all the time. And there's a particular kind of chengyu, which is I shema. So one something, or 1x, 2y. The most famous example of this is the Chinese language term for the relationship with Hong Kong, which is 一国两制, one country, two systems. And there is, because of how it sounds to the Chinese ear, I believe, and I've tested this with native speakers, I'm not a native speaker, that it carries implicit ideas and allusions within that. So we could put it this way. If the Chinese decided, if the PRC decided tomorrow that they wanted to stop calling the terminology for China's independent judiciary and so forth, they want to change the term from one country, two systems to say the Country and Systems Initiative, the United States government would probably and rightfully push back and say, no, you're eliding you're using a linguistic change to force a very, very different kind of idea. And we don't want to let you get away with that. So similarly, the Belt and Road Initiative suggests China going out grandly by land and sea to encompass the earth. And the Belt and Road Initiative sounds more vague, but also friendlier, more cooperative. And it was part of a rebrand that happened in 2016-17 to make the thing less threatening to foreigners. It also came along with a directive from the Central Propaganda Department, which was circulated by a pseudonymous but clearly official source on Chinese social media that had all of these directives about language you couldn't use to describe it. One of them was you can't call it a strategy, a zhangle, which has militaristic connotations in Chinese. But clearly this is a strategy. So I don't think we should let China dictate the terms of how we think about it. If they really wanted to change the name, they would have changed the Chinese name.
Yeah, well, I think any revision to 一国两制, one country, two systems, is probably going to be 一国一制 at this point. One country, one system, given what's going on in Hong Kong, but we've done a couple sessions on that. So, I mean, you've given us an overview of what it looks like from the Xi Jinping and the high-level policy China angle. Why do they want to do this? It's a strategy, and it's a legacy thing for Xi Jinping. It's a return to historical grandeur for China, and so on. But there's also kind of a messy story that gets told about where the current One Belt, One Road, or BRI comes from. So there's a story that it's, Xi's legacy, as you say. There's a story that there are internal dynamics in China that are driving it. State-owned enterprises with surplus capacity that seek an outlet. The Chinese military, the PLA, looking for bases or at least access. Local governments that are trying to find ways to get their projects out there. Or, as the old joke went about the United States after 9/11, if you wanted anybody in government to support your project, you stuck "and the war on terror" at the end of it. So now you stick "and OBOR" at the end of whatever your pet project is within China. So there's this kind of nefarious geopolitical story. There's this Xi Jinping great leader story, and there's this kind of let's shovel everything we want to do in a very decentralized way under this umbrella. So how do you weight the credibility of those various explanations, their importance if they're all going on, and what's missing from those accounts?
Well, I think that's exactly right. So in terms of talking about how the Belt and Road is administered, the best way to think about it is not Marshall Plan. Don't think top-down, centrally organized. There's a map in Beijing where they know what all the projects are and how they interact. There's no spreadsheet where they're keeping track of, the single spreadsheet where they're keeping track of where all the money has gone and who's paying back what at what interest rate on what terms. So such a thing does not exist. This emerged in a scattershot way, and its origins were the going out policy that was implemented by the reformists, particularly this premier named Zhu Rongji in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So essentially, at this point in history, China was reaching the limits of the economic boom that it could sustain through autarkic growth. And Zhu Rongji was realizing, first of all, China was on the verge of acceding to the World Trade Organization and was going to have to expose many of its bloated state-owned sectors that had never before faced foreign competition to the international marketplace. And he and his advisors were also extrapolating, and they were saying, well, by God, if we keep growing at the rate we're going, in 10 or 15 years, we'll be consuming half of the world's concrete, half of the world's copper, half of the world's iron ore. We need to secure our supplies of these things. And so what emerged over the course of the 2000s was a highly uncoordinated, decentralized effort by state-owned enterprises mainly, but with help from state policy banks to, they say, go out, literally walk out of China in search of a supply chain. So ensure that you get the mine or the forest where your timber comes from or wherever your natural resources are. We will help you get financing to build the roads, the ports, the airports, the ancillary infrastructure you need to get your raw materials to China. And then on the far end of the vertically integrated supply chain, we'll support companies like Costco, the shipper, to help make sure that it has stakes in the various ports around the world where it does business so that we can deliver Chinese goods to market. And in the process, we'll make investments in the export processing zones, special economic zones in these various countries. In places like Greece, we'll negotiate favorable tax exemptions to lock in the access of Chinese finished goods to the developed country markets, mainly in Europe and North America. So this was a strategy that developed over the course of the 2000s, but it coincided also with, for the first time, restrictions being lifted so that Chinese private enterprises could invest abroad. And you saw this tsunami of Chinese money spilling out of the country, much of it not towards projects that fulfilled any kind of national interests, but because it was individuals or companies that wanted to hedge and buy a condo in Vancouver or something like that. And so there was a recognition, and I trace this in a lot of detail in the book, going into the 18th Party Congress in 2012, where Xi Jinping was elevated to the top job. There was an understanding that we need some form of new concept or national strategy to exert some kind of discipline or logic on this, because this is a lot of money, national resources that were earned and saved at great expense, which are being spent frivolously. And several concepts were considered for what this would be. Among them were 中国的马萨尔计划, a Chinese Marshall Plan. They also talked about a marching westwards plan. And they considered and discarded several possibilities. And the one that they settled on was this one belt, one road idea, which came out of a concept of rebuilding the ancient Silk Road. But it has taken them several years to implement it. And in the process, many companies continue to do things overseas without close central oversight. And so it has taken some time for them to exert more discipline over it. I believe, though this has yet to be tested, that coming out of the pandemic, they will have much more centralized control over this, because they can use COVID as an excuse to tie off financially unviable projects and focus, rather than on super high risk, super speculative, mega investment projects. Rather than that, focusing on much more immediate win-win trading relationships. And they have a new concept for this called dual circulation, which has to do with strengthening the Chinese consumer. And this seems to be the direction that things are going. The focus will be on digital, on green tech, on public health, stuff like vaccines. So to make the final point about asking, that you asked, this is a rambling answer, but it's an important point about how everyone, every ministry, every province, every major company in China, public or private, has been trying to associate themselves with this. I think this is part of the point. It is a Maoist style mass mobilization campaign. And the purpose is not to micromanage, but to set a direction and allow experimentation at the lower levels to see the most effective way of getting it done. And it's also a virtue signaling exercise for the kitchenware manufacturers to show their loyalty to Xi Jinping, for various universities, particularly for enterprises in Hong Kong, which has been on the ropes, to show that they're actually supportive of the mainland. So this is a buzzword that you can use in order to signal your loyalty and compete for resources. And so I think seen in that light, it has been a very effective tool for Xi Jinping to consolidate his control over the system by establishing himself as the central disperser of state resources.
Okay, we have several questions that have come in the chat that I think cluster around the idea of the economics of Belt and Road, right? So there are several strands to what this means, including, I'll list some of them. You can engage with them. One is that this is debt trap diplomacy. That is, it is getting recipient countries deeply in hock so that China can, as a strategic manipulative matter, gain leverage over them. That's one of the stories that's told about the Sri Lankan port, much disputed as an account, but certainly out there in the discourse. A related question is, aren't these just terrible projects financially? That is, there's a lot of money being invested badly, and as you suggested, the concern that was happening was one of the reasons for putting this policy and slogan package together. And so what happens when some of these start going belly up, when these are not viable? So even if it's not a debt trap diplomacy story, it can be a story of problems for the Chinese enterprises and a story about the leverage that comes even with accidental debt. It's basically China potentially getting out over its skis into some areas where it doesn't really know quite what it's doing, or the companies don't know quite what they're doing. And then so we're going to have the dislocation that comes with that. So I'll leave it there with a couple of related points. Why not just get you to address that first?
Okay, two very good questions. to me, having done all these events, there's softballs right down the middle. So I'll do what I can. The debt trap, I think, is complete nonsense. I think it's a terrible, terrible misdiagnosis of what this is. It was a cynical and intellectually lazy intellectual innovation of the Trump administration. And I think the Biden administration finally is waking up to the reality that it was bad policy. There, let me try to defend those claims. The idea implicit in the concept of the debt trap is that China knows something that little countries, or that we know something about China that other countries do not. That China goes in and they can either coerce or fool gullible, poor little countries who don't know what's in their self-interest, and can offer them all these goodies, and they will sign up for them, and all of a sudden find China's their debt master. And the reason that is wrong is you just have to go to any recipient country that has joined the Belt and Road or done a deal and start interviewing the senior officials. And you'll find basically anywhere you go, most developing countries are run by small cliques of policy elites who are Western educated, highly sophisticated, rational, and often self-interested actors. Many of them have experience working with international lenders in the past, or they've worked at Western financial institutions. They have absolutely no illusions that China is potentially another colonial actor come to take their resources or exploit their people. So these are people who, as their life and livelihood, deal with foreign lending, and they know that foreign money comes with strings attached. So the fact that dozens of these countries, including in the last 3 years, over a dozen countries in Latin America and over 10 countries in the Caribbean have signed up to the Belt and Road, should indicate that it offers a value proposition sufficiently desirable that these countries would sign up, knowing not only the risks that China might coerce them and debt entrap them, but also the risk that they could face diplomatic blowback from the United States and the Trump administration. So how exactly does this fill local interests? Let's take the most famous example, which is the Hambantota Port in the south of Sri Lanka. By a pure act of chance, I had settled on this. This is the reason why I got a book as a graduate student. I had settled on this for my master's thesis project before it became world famous, when it was just one of hundreds of Chinese infrastructure projects in the developing world. So I was there interviewing local people, foremen on the job, Chinese construction workers up to and including Sri Lankan bigwigs in Colombo in 2017. And then I came back in 2018, a few weeks after China famously renegotiated to get all the equity on a 99-year lease. And what I found was that this was not something that the Sri Lankans felt they had been coerced into doing. In fact, it was the opposite. It was something they felt they had hoodwinked the Chinese into doing. You see, Hambantota was the hometown of Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was this pretty shady character. He had emerged during the Civil War, had won the Civil War over the Tamils with scorched earth tactics and war crimes. He had in the process alienated most of the international community, particularly India, the giant power on Sri Lanka's doorstep that has interfered in its internal affairs since the beginning of time. And also the United States, which was trying to hold him to account for war crimes at the International Court of Justice. So a relationship with China, first and foremost, was a geopolitical hedge for him. It was a way to keep India from interfering to knock him out of power and keep from facing international tribunals. And he, by the way, succeeded in avoiding the tribunals. He didn't succeed from being toppled by the Indians. But the second thing he wanted to do was bring home bacon to his hometown. Hambantota was a economically underdeveloped, very disconnected part of the country, and he wanted to build a legacy project there full of lots of infrastructure with his name on it. The international lenders that he asked, first the Japanese, then the World Bank, and all the others, didn't want to do it, but the Chinese did. And then the third point is that he had a patronage network that had delivered him to the presidency, but also involved his brothers and some very complicated schemes inside Sri Lanka that related to the governance of the country. And he had local actors that he had to pay off. And the various projects that he did in his hometown allowed him to do it. In the meantime, he did a much larger port in the capital of Colombo, also financed and built by Chinese enterprises, which has become a monumental commercial success and the fastest growing port in South Asia. So it should have come as no surprise that in 2015, when he faced re-election, not only did the Americans and the Indians try to bump him from power, but the opposition ran on an anti-China ticket. The Belt and Road was Mahinda Rajapaksa's deal with the Chinese to exchange this long-term benefit to China in exchange for short-term perks that would help him stay in power. And the opposition won. And the first thing they did was they said, we're doing a backlash, we're freezing all Chinese projects in the country. But the fact was that once the opposition was now in power, the logic of Belt and Road started to work in their favor. And the Chinese said, well, we'll do a favorable deal to take this unviable Hambantota Port off your hands. What would you like? A coal-fired power plant? Would you like a road network? And so pretty soon, the former opposition was now even more pro-China than Rajapaksa had been. And this is a pattern that we see replicated all across the developing world, including in countries like Malaysia, many countries in Africa. Headline-grabbing short-term moves to criticize China that are presented in the West as backlash to the Belt and Road are often just kabuki renegotiations where a new government is trying to adjust the relationship so that it will start working for them. And that is, I think, what is so tricky about this. Local officials in recipient countries are not being coerced. They're being offered something that fulfills very immediate needs for them. And that is why it's going to be very tricky for the United States to compete and push back. And this is why also, if we are trying to assess what China is actually doing with building this infrastructure, it's a mistake to look at a few high-profile projects that go belly up, because many of the people who are authorizing those projects in the first place aren't assessing their success or failure on the basis of what you would see on a balance sheet. I'll stop there in case you have more questions, but that's the essential point.
Okay, let me take a couple of things that come out of that. So we're going to shift some to the perspective of the recipient countries of BRI, and obviously, or OBOR. This is obviously a highly diverse group. So you've just told a story essentially of the Sri Lankan example and touched on some others. So in some cases, we're going to see fully democratically elected leaders responding to pressures. There was some of that went on in Malaysia, where there was a little corruption scandal with the prior government. There are going to be some cases where they're not so accountable elites who may, as one of our questioners points out, be serving their own interests, not exactly the interests of the long-term interests of the citizenry of the local country. So let's look a little bit around that periphery. One of our questioners notes that among the nearest countries on the Silk Road, the new Silk Road, are countries in Central Asia. And these are Islamic countries, in many cases having not just religious ties, but in the very near abroad, ethnic ties with people in Xinjiang. So how is China managing that particular tension? As many people note, majority Islamic countries or predominantly Islamic countries have been remarkably silent about Xinjiang. China has, even as it has presented itself as a benign actor on the Belt and Road front, is simultaneously engaged in something which could raise some doubts about goodwill toward at least some Muslims. So what's been the reaction in that part of the world? How does that fit into your story?
Well, it's a good question. It's obviously a horrendous thing that is happening in Xinjiang. It's the correct term for it. The only possible correct term for it is genocide. It meets every international legal definition of genocide that I have read. And it's unjustified by the examples we have seen of scattered terrorist attacks allegedly committed by Uyghurs. It's a disproportionate crackdown, and it is not obviously in any way acceptable under international law. And so I think it is a puzzle to be explained that many Muslim countries, including Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman was feted last time he went to Beijing, and he signed agreements on exchanges and cooperation on public security. That's code for I endorse what you're doing. In Indonesia, in many other Muslim countries where you would expect to see pushback, Pakistan, Turkey, because not long ago, there was a substantial political movement in Turkey that stood for the Uyghurs. There are Turkic people. Turkey feels, particularly some Turkish nationalists feel, they have a greater responsibility for the Uyghurs as distantly related cousins. And yet, from the Erdogan government, you've seen nothing at all. And Turkey is a Belt and Road signatory as well. So in a sense, it's the dog that didn't bark that we should be listening for here. I don't think, contrary to most of the reporting in, say, the New York Times, that Central Asia is or ever has been a priority destination for investment in the Belt and Road framework. And there's a bunch of reasons why. One is that China built most of the infrastructure it needed in Central Asia to get the natural resources out in the 2000s before Xi Jinping took power. And it is never going to be more economically viable to transport goods en masse from China to Europe by rail through 8,000 miles of Siberia, essentially, than to put them on a COSCO merchant vessel and ship it to a port in Europe that is also largely owned by COSCO. So I think the overland infrastructure element of this has been exaggerated, which means that the economic benefits that have accrued to many of these Central Asian states has been less than we might have expected. I think China is also, last point, very concerned about provoking an overreaction from the Russians. So I go into this in some detail in the Russia case of the book. In the early days of Belt and Road, most of the Russian intelligence and defense establishments were very concerned. And they wrote and said, this is a Chinese ploy to steal Central Asia from us. And by the way, if the Chinese build a trans-Eurasian rail line, they will put the Trans-Siberian out of business and sever the bloodline that keeps the Russian Far East economically sustained. And so the Russians have been, first of all, very strict in regulating Chinese capital investment in their own borders. They've accepted some Chinese investment in oil and gas, but the only other big Belt and Road project they were going to do was a high-speed rail line, and that is stuck in the mud, apparently under orders from Putin himself. So the Russians basically communicated to the Chinese, we will be all right if you make some limited investments in Central Asia, but we want a balance of power with you. And I believe, based on some informed speculation and some sources, the details are in the book, that there was essentially an agreement made over the course of 2014-15, when the Russians had this falling out with the West over Ukraine and had to show that they had options and signed up for the Belt and Road. There was an understanding Putin would show up at the forums, he would stand on the red carpet with Xi Jinping, and in return there would be some form of implicit balance in Central Asia. And I think that's where we're at, and the Chinese are basically happy with it, because for the reasons I've just described, they're much more interested in markets elsewhere where there's lower hanging geostrategic fruit to be plucked.
Okay, so setting aside the overheated debt trap diplomacy, plot for a soft form of China-centered colonialism, Chinese foreign policy does have a quite rich history, right down to the contemporary period, of using levers of influence to get other states to align with China on issues that are salient to China. So we've seen in the South China Sea context, for instance, splitting ASEAN into states that are relatively close to China so that ASEAN can't act coherently behind the rival claimant states. You see a lot of concern in Europe about Belt and Road money going to Eastern and Central European countries, sort of breaking up the new EU from the old EU and the just outside the EU categories. So even if one doesn't attribute manipulation and if one attributes full agency to the recipient countries, what's the answer to this being part of the leverage that China has and will use to get other states to align with China, especially on interests that are important to China, but that are not necessarily of great concern to the recipient countries? I mean, what does Bulgaria care about Taiwan, for instance?
Well, what does Nicaragua care about Taiwan? One of the features of the Belt and Road's expansion into the Americas that began in 2017-18 and has since signed up more than half of the countries in the Americas is the fact that most of the remaining countries that recognize Taiwan as opposed to the PRC were small Latin American countries which had been encouraged by the United States for legacy reasons to continue supporting Taipei. And Beijing is trying to peel these countries away one at a time by saying, hey, we're, if not your largest trading partner, then your second largest. And we have all of these things to offer you. Why are you continuing to recognize this little rebel island across the straits? And they haven't been entirely successful in that endeavor, but Taiwan isn't winning back any countries who are taking away their diplomatic recognition. So it is a slow effort to erode what remaining autonomy Taiwan has left. Certainly, it's reflective of the way that Xi Jinping thinks, that building infrastructure, doing these sorts of strategic projects is a way to win the facts on the ground. He's done it very effectively with island building in the South China Sea, also in defiance of international law. And most recently in the 5-year plan that we learned about last week, the new idea, which is something that he's been advocating since he was running Fujian province more than a decade ago, is let's reunite with Taiwan by building a bridge to Taiwan and daring them to stop us, which is a pretty ominous and potentially very effective strategy. So certainly if you look at Europe, I have a chapter on Greece, and Greece was one of the first countries to flip in Europe to flip to China. China came to help them out. Actually, the Germans and the Brussels bureaucrats invited China to come help Greece out in the wake of the financial crisis when they were doing the fire sale of Greek national assets. And the Chinese said, well, yes, thank you very much. We'll have a port and a railway. That sounds great. But the Chinese also said to the Greeks, we will be more than an investor, we'll be a partner. Wen Jiabao, the Chinese premier, toured the Acropolis with the Greek prime minister and said, what, the Elgin marbles, these beautiful marbles at the Parthenon, they should be here, they shouldn't be in the British Museum, we'll help you get them back. So in a sense, it is an appeal to national pride. It is more than infrastructure. It is a comprehensive sort of partnership that China is offering to smaller countries, to Orban's Hungary, in local ways that are very country specific. They do offer a measure of power. Viktor Orban wields influence in the European Union far beyond what the GDP of Hungary would suggest, because he has these relationships with China and Russia. So I think there is a logic to it, but we shouldn't focus so much on Chinese geostrategy that we neglect to understand why China's partners are willing. Because I think if we don't understand that, we're going to get the foreign policy answers totally wrong.
Okay, so we've talked some about how this is part of a broader package and pattern of Chinese statecraft, diplomatic statecraft attempts to influence other states. The other part of the story that comes in here in terms of Chinese influence often is that the One Belt, One Road approach and affiliated things like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, things like this, are potentially setting up rival institutional orders that are corrosive of the World Bank, the IMF, the kind of standards that the US, Europe, and other investors tend to demand in terms of anti-corruption, perhaps human rights and things like that. So it's changing not just the positions of other countries, which of course indirectly influence international norms, but it's creating sort of counter norms and potential institutional foundations for counter norms that will change the landscape in quite profound ways.
I think that's completely right. And China doesn't have, I would note that China doesn't have to succeed in all of its endeavors to still get what it wants, because it can it can make its efforts to expand its role in the international system in the same way that it sandboxes stuff domestically. You know, you used to hear about ghost cities in China, and they still do exist. You can still find them, but they're not important. They're trivial as a share of GDP, so they've been forgotten about, and they're in a field somewhere. And similarly, I think China is experimenting. I think they're experimenting on Australia, what tactics they can get away with in terms of using trade as an instrument of coercion. They're experimenting on the border with India, what kinds of tactics they can get away with in terms of antics on the border. I think they experimented with the United States with the rare earths embargo in 2010. I think China likes to move, the Chinese system, it's bloated, it's bureaucratic, it likes to move incrementally, it likes to have precedent before it takes big decisions. And so yes, they are gradually building a whole array of institutions, which are being continuously renovated and improved and reformed. And some of these will not be essential to a new regional or global order that China is trying to build, and some of them will be very effective. So let me talk briefly about the ones I think will be most effective. I think it's the digital Silk Road. Huawei is one, but these Chinese digital payments applications are another. For all of the discussion about Huawei, it is true that the Anglophone world has rejected Huawei. It is true that most of the key NATO allies in Western and Northern Europe have rejected Huawei. But not every American ally and partner has. In fact, the United States, all but under the Trump administration, when it had its maximum influence and leverage over the Gulf states, all but begged Riyadh and Abu Dhabi to reject Huawei. But they ignored the Trump administration and they accepted them into their 5G networks. The Kuwaitis did too. The Trump administration tried to get most of its allies and partners to reject Chinese vaccines, and some of them did. The Brazilian president Bolsonaro acted like it wasn't going to work, but the many heads of state, including the Emir of Dubai, got the Sinopharm vaccine on television. So I think we are finding that we're not able to win every battle when we're trying to coerce or persuade our allies and partners not to join these. And so we need to focus on the ones which, once they join, will be hard to get out of. Huawei is one, and then the other would be digital payments platforms, which offer just a more convenient and enjoyable technology to use than SWIFT, instant clearance of transactions across borders, which will be aided by the rollout of a new digital RMB in as soon as a year's time. And this is potentially a real risk to the hegemony of the United States dollar, the exorbitant privilege of the United States dollar in the international financial system. And it's a threat to our ability to use financial sanctions as a tool to get our diplomatic objectives achieved. So I think we need to recognize that it's not just a question of trying to persuade countries, don't sign up for Huawei, because once you do, all the rest of the suite of Chinese tech services will become much more attracted to you because they're interoperable with Huawei. It's also a question of recognizing that if we continue to use our same old toolkit, which is relying on financial sanctions as the default, we're going to be actually not just failing to pull, we'll be pushing our allies and partners into using these Chinese systems, and then they may never get out.
And this is sort of a segue into our next set of questions on U.S. responses, but this is one of the things that makes it challenging for U.S. foreign policy, that as much of what China is doing is not transparently or inherently revisionist or manipulative or toward a Cold War type leverage, but it does create options and channels for China to make its great run, and you just don't really know. So you either prepare for the most paranoid reading, or you offer the most paranoid reading, which sounds shrill, or you pretend there's not a risk and not a problem. And I think that's a lot of what drives the discourse here. So we have several questions about U.S. responses to this, sort of how the U.S. can and should manage the set of risks and consequences you're talking about, and just to weave a few of the questions that have come in here. How much did the U.S. make its own task harder here with some of what the Trump administration did on trade and engagement and perhaps demonizing China as well? They definitely demonized China. The question is, how much does it matter in this space? And to what extent is the U.S. able to find new modes of cooperation with allies? As Gilbert Rosman, is one of our senior fellows, points out, Blinken is off addressing the U.S.-Japan relationship right now. Is that a way of kind of shoring up and coordinating on how to deal with the consequences of the Belt and Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road?
Yeah, this is a nice synthesis of the many good questions we've gotten, and I wish I could take them all. I'll try to be as more concise and as concise as I can be. I think the correct way to approach this is to start with national interests. Right now, the Belt and Road does not threaten, nor does it conceivably threaten, any vital American national interests. The lives and livelihoods of civilians, the integrity of American institutions, none of these are at risk. So I think looking ahead 5, 10, 15 years, yes, there is a probability, and it is not zero, that this thing flames out of its own accord. China faces internal financial difficulties. Xi Jinping runs into resistance of various kinds. China's tech catch up and surpass strategy falls flat. There's any number of exogenous shocks that could disrupt this thing. But I think our objective has to be keep this from becoming a geopolitical bloc that is a Warsaw Pact plus that includes the 21st century high-tech digital technologies, satellites, an alternative financial ecosystem, an alternative energy ecosystem, and has lots of members and friendly partner states, including in the Americas. I think we, under no circumstances, should tolerate that outcome. And we need to think backwards about how we prevent that sort of eventuality from happening. In the book, I propose 3 options. I think essentially we can confront it at every turn. We can hedge by selectively engaging and trying to compete intelligently with it. And we can engage with it and say, well, we'll keep it out of our own systems. We'll keep it maybe out of our sphere of influence. We'll have a neo-Monroe doctrine maybe. It's not in the, no Huawei in Mexico, no ports in the Caribbean. But if you want to build roads in Africa or something like that, power to you. I think essentially we have 3 options, and it comes down to how threatened are we by this idea, as to go back to the diagnosis at the beginning, that in China, this is being pitched as a neo-tributary system. How bothered are we if many countries in Asia, particularly smaller ones, particularly less democratic ones, are engaged in some form of tributary exercise with China? Is this something we can live with, or is this something we cannot live with? And then what is the order of magnitude of national resources that we are willing to deploy in terms of industrial strategy, in terms of industrial policy, foreign aid, military investments, and all the rest to compete with this thing? And I don't know what the answer is. We'll see. It seems that this might be the next legislative priority for the Democrats. But if, as I expect, we're not willing to spend trillions of dollars to compete with the Belt and Road, then we need an asymmetric strategy, because we cannot match them road for road, port for port. And I think that means picking and choosing countries, regions, sectors that matter more than others, and focusing on the most important allies and partners and strategic countries, and making sure that they are being offered a better deal on a project level when it comes to something like 5G, or there will one day be a 6G and a 7G, but also for various other high-tech products. I think this should be our focus, because if we try to compete with this everywhere, we will tire ourselves out and we will waste our resources in places that they don't belong.
I'd agree. I thought that one of the mistakes of policy in recent years was to put out the Build Act as somehow parallels to BRI, and clearly it's not playing the same zone. but so some of the questions here and add to this is the extent to which we have dug a significant hole for ourselves here, right? So that is the strident tech wars, which some would say accelerated China's move toward dual circulation and tech self-sufficiency, putting a lot of countries that don't like being caught in the middle of this tug of war when they'd really prefer not to have to plunk their chips down right now. And a moment when there are huge domestic political pressures in the US to be pretty anti-China. I mean, probably the most bipartisan thing you can find right now in Washington, this is a cheat because there's practically nothing, but one of the bipartisan things you can find is let's get tougher on China. And nobody anywhere across the spectrum thinks that for all of the Trump to Biden differences, we're going to dial back the clock to, say, the early Obama administration in terms of engaging China. And you can score a lot of political points by saying we need to be tough here. And it's a longer term trend to essentially turn every economic issue into a security issue and a point of rivalry on that front. So do we need to pull in our horns a little bit on that as part of the strategy you're talking about?
Well, I'm a Biden Democrat, so I will defend this administration's approach. I know and deeply respect many of the people running China in this administration. I think the Biden team is right that it starts at home. It's encouraging that Republicans, would you believe it? Republicans are using the words industrial policy. I think we do need some of that. I think we need to invest in our infrastructure. We need to make sure that our immigration system continues to be a force that is attracting talent from the rest of the world rather than repelling it. I think we need to make sure that we are designing regulations in such a way that our tech companies are not able to sit back and rake in rents, but are being incentivized to innovate. And that means thinking about a whole range of thorny issues in the role of technology in our society. I think in the green transition, there's a lot that we can do that is low-hanging fruit to make sure that China doesn't win this industrial competition before we start. And part of it is thinking the way the Chinese have been doing about vertically integrating our supply chains for critical minerals. We are late to this party, but thankfully it is not too late. Rare earths are not, as the name suggests, particularly rare. We have reserves of lithium and other critical minerals in our own soil and in our allies. We can focus on those. We can support our automakers as they go through this painful green transition and so forth. But I think we also need to be humble. Look, the United States has this tremendous asset that China doesn't have, which is we have allies and partners. And a large number of countries in the Indo-Pacific region are democracies who are unnerved by the rise of a communist party that doesn't seem to respect international rules and norms. And so we have an opportunity here to use diplomacy to act as a force multiplier for our national power. And the Biden administration understands that too. But it starts with not persuasion necessarily, because countries believe they understand what their own national interest is. Nor does it start with compulsion, which is what the Trump administration thought we could do, barreling ahead with America first and hoping that others would follow us. We need to find a middle way that starts with listening and finding common ground to meet our partners where they are. And if we can do that, I think we can set a basic roadmap of how everyone in the world would basically like China to behave. And we can socialize the Chinese Communist Party as at least semi-responsible actor. And if we can do that, and we can keep it from building a geopolitical bloc, I think we will have done our job and gotten the best possible outcome.
Well, thanks. We're just about up against our time here, and I think that's a good note to wrap up on. I thank everyone for joining us. I thank you for the terrific set of questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them, but thank you, Eyck Freymann, for a terrific discussion. The book, once again, is One Belt, One Road. I'm going to get the subtitle here. Chinese Power Meets the World, right? And it's available on all your usual platforms, Harvard University Press, Amazon, all those kinds of things. It's clearly a rich book in content, and it's got a terrific cover. So I thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Eyck, for a terrific talk. And we'll see you all at our next events. We've got next Thursday, we touched briefly upon green issues here. Next Thursday, we'll have Alex Long from UCLA talking about sort of carbon issues, competition and cooperation between the US on climate change issues, and more over the horizon beyond that. If you're not an FPRI member or donor, please consider becoming one so that we can continue to bring you programs like we did today. Thank you all. See you soon. Thanks again, Eyck.